Chapter 1 A World at War. The Mobley settlement buzzed with news as a crowd gathered at the meeting house. From the low murmurs of the residents, it didn't sound like good news. A blue knitted cap bobbed through the crowd. The citizens of Mobley patiently took turns reading the news on the wooden sign. William Cox searched for Anne and spotted her blue cap near the front. He walked over to where she stood, listening to the mill operator speak of the British troops approaching the settlement. Anne, she heard from her right, and spotted Mr. Cox motioning to her. She left the front row position and quickly went to the older man. "What have you heard?" he asked, eager to learn more. "He says it's Tory troops," she relayed fearfully. "They're heading north and may come through here." William Cox gently nudged her. "Go to Hannah and tell her of the news." Before Anne darted off, he snatched her dress sleeve. "Don't upset her," he added with a warning to the young woman. Nodding, Anne understood his meaning. She had no love for the British or their armies. Now wasn't the time for stirring people up, though. Following the destruction of her own family, Anne struggled with her anger towards the British. The elder, William Cox, often counseled her for expressing her hatred towards them. She understood that he only wanted to protect her, but how could he remain quiet? The Cox family had taken her in following the raids on the regulators in North Carolina. Her father, a farmer, had taken arms and joined the regulators in fighting the British. It was an unorganized battle, and the surviving regulators were rounded up and either hung or imprisoned. Her father remained alive in the jails as far as she was aware, but rumors swirled that there were no surviving regulators after Cornwallis arrived in the southern colonies. After the battle, the British came and raided her family's home, taking all their supplies. It was intended to starve out the remaining landowners' wives and children. When they abandoned their homesteads, British investors purchased their land. If the remaining women and children didn't leave, they would have their land seized after defaulting on massive property tax debt placed on the rebellious colonists. The plan worked, and Anne's mother became so weak she succumbed to the malnutrition and illness. Anne, her only child, was almost a woman and suddenly alone. Nearby neighbors, the Cox family, often did business with her father, and their son Benjamin had been a close friend. William and Hannah Cox decided to invite Anne into their family and asked her to come with them to South Carolina. Benjamin was overjoyed that she agreed. Together, he and Anne would navigate the wars and find peace in a new place, far away from the conflict. Chapter 2 The Raid at Mobley's Meeting House. In June of 1780, the British and their loyalists came to Mobley's meeting house. The air was thick with fear. Anne had woken up early, as she often did, to fetch water from the creek. From there she could see the meeting house, perched above like a fortress, with the British surrounding it. The soldiers had been there for days, plundering homes and taking their winter supplies. The Mobley settlement on Little River was 12 miles west of Winnsboro in the upcountry. When the British arrived, they set out immediately to recruit young men to fight the Patriots. But many had already joined South Carolina militias under Marion, Sumter, and Pickens. These militias were known to Cornwallis as a menace, and he called them swamp ghosts. They were not part of the Continental Army under Washington and used guerrilla warfare tactics to attack British troops in the forest and swamps. In the Mobley settlement, these men were quiet legends who used their knowledge of the land to attack the British. Edward Mobley and his sons were friends of the Cox family. Mr. Mobley came to their cabin and informed William they would all be enlisting with the Patriots. Mr. Cox announced it to the family in a hushed voice at the dinner table. He was visibly frightened for his friend entering this war and feared his own son would join. With war surrounding them, no matter where they tried to escape, the Revolutionary War demanded they all pick a side. As William spoke of the Mobley men joining the militias, Anne lifted her eyelashes to see Benjamin across the table. He didn't notice her enticing glance. He had a different desire in his eyes, the need to fight. The war had caught up with Anne and threatened everything she had left. The raid at Mobley's meeting house was the first time Anne truly understood they were all at war. Every family in the upcountry, it wasn't just soldiers who fought. It was neighbors, friends, and ordinary people joining the Patriots. Anne hadn't wanted to come to this place in the South where the Loyalists gathered, flaunting their power. But when the Cox family took her in, she decided it was safer in the wilderness than risk the wrath of the British in North Carolina. She had little choice. Her heart broke for the people whose livelihoods were being stolen, but what could she do to stop it? The long war had changed much in the frontier communities, and the suffering at the hands of the British had become tiresome for the younger generations who felt angry at the injustice. The British were aware of these divided loyalties and kept the younger citizens under a watchful eye. When the soldiers came knocking at the Cox residence, the women were so frightened that Anne stood silent with her head down. They ordered Hannah around and had her empty every shelf in the pantry. The night before the Patriot militias attacked, the Tories at the Mobley meeting house were smug, laden with stolen goods, sacks of grain, bolts of fabric, livestock, and tools, things they had ripped from the locals' hands as if they had every right. They lounged around the meeting house, eating the food and awaiting British reinforcements. Anne kept her head down. She tended to chores, but could feel their watchful eyes, always searching for signs of disloyalty. Anne had seen too much already. The British took everything from her family in North Carolina, and now here they tore through South Carolina, leaving the Cox family and their neighbors with barely enough to survive. The parallel to what happened to her own family was too similar, and her anger over the injustice increased. Anne heard the whispers from residents. The Patriots are coming. Patriot leaders Richard Wynne, William Bratton, and John McClure were rallying men nearby to liberate the Mobley settlement. Benjamin Cox had also heard the Patriots were coming, and the fire in his eyes when he spoke of joining them told Anne there'd be no stopping him. He was restless, pacing the ground with his fists clenched, his jaw tight. "I can't sit by and let them keep doing this, Anne," he said, his voice low but fierce. "They've stolen our land, our food, and our lives. It's time we took it back." Anne's first instinct was to beg him to stay, but she couldn't say the words. How could she ask him to stay when everything inside her knew he was right? The war had come for them all, whether they wanted it or not. Chapter 3. The Patriots Strike Back. At dawn, the Patriots came. That morning, after a restless night, Anne went to the creek to gather water as usual when she saw a movement in the brush. Her breath caught in her throat and her eyes focused through the thick wooded area. At first, she thought it was just a deer slipping through the brush, but then she saw the glint of sunlight on steel. Her heart pounded as she realized what she was seeing. Men, dozens of them, creeping towards the meeting house, rifles in hand and faces set with grim determination. They moved like shadows through the forest, rifles glinting in the soft morning light. Anne stood frozen at the embankment with her empty pail. They slipped past her, silent as the Cherokee. She scrambled back up the embankment, her skirts catching on the brambles. She could see the men at the blockhouse lazily sharpening their blades and sharing jokes, oblivious to the threat closing in around them. She thought to shout a warning out of obedience, but stopped herself. What loyalty did she owe them? Instead, she turned and ran to the cabin at the edge of the woods to warn the Cox family that the Patriots had arrived. The attack began with a round of shots that echoed through the trees. The Loyalists scrambled, their former confidence dissolving into a panic. Red-coat soldiers ran for the blockhouse, shouting orders that went unheard in the chaos. The British were unprepared and could not build a formation. The Loyalists tried to run. The attack came swift and ferocious. Patriots struck from 3 sides, their rifles cracking in the morning air. Flocks of crows flew from the trees among the smoke of gunpowder blasting. Shouting commands erupted as the Tories scrambled to defend themselves, their confidence shattered by the sudden assault. Some tried to flee the gunfire down the embankment, but the steep slope was treacherous. Anne watched from behind a stump in stunned silence as men tumbled, their cries echoing through the trees. The blockhouse was taken quickly. Its defenders were too unprepared to retaliate. Anne crept to the edge of the meeting house when the gunfire stopped. The Patriots had moved with precision, securing the area, reclaiming the community's stolen goods, and taking prisoners. When the dust settled, the Tory stronghold on the community was over. Benjamin emerged from a cloud of gun smoke, revealing himself as a soldier among the Patriots, his rifle steady as he advanced on the remaining Tories. Anne's heart ached watching him, torn between fear for his life and pride in his courage. In the distance, she saw the face of William Cox, wrinkled in anguish that his son had taken arms. Chapter 4. The Call to Arms. A militia soldier groaned as Anne pressed the poultice to his leg. The wound oozed blood and sharp pains of infection caused him to squirm. She worked quickly, her hands steady as she noticed the shadows of the late afternoon growing. Anne had always felt more comfortable in the woods than anywhere else. It was here among the oaks and pine that she found the herbs she needed to ease the soldier's pain. "I've seen men pass out from less," a voice said from behind her, calm. Anne glanced over her shoulder to see a man standing tall, his posture commanding yet approachable. His graying hair peeked from beneath his hat, and his eyes were sharp and thoughtful. He wore the simple yet sturdy uniform of a militia leader, his presence both steady and formidable. Anne recognized him right away from the battle. "Colonel Pickens," she said, nodding respectfully, turning to her patient. She didn't need an introduction to know who he was. His reputation preceded him. Andrew Pickens was known to be wise, cunning, and deeply rooted in the land he fought for. Andrew Pickens was a legend in those parts. He crouched beside her, his movements quiet and deliberate. "What's in that?" he asked, pointing at the poultice she prepared. "Plantain leaves and yarrow," Anne replied, glancing up at him briefly. "The plantain leaves draw out the infection, and the yarrow helps stop the bleeding." He studied her face for a moment and then nodded. "You know your craft." "It's what I have to offer. Anne said simply. I'm no soldier. You don't have to carry a rifle to serve the cause, Pickens said. Every man here needs someone like you in battle. His words, spoken with genuine respect, warmed her. She began to relax in his presence. Anne wrapped the wound with a strip of linen from her skirt, tucking the ends in carefully to keep it secure. That should hold until he can rest properly, she said, sitting back on her heels. Pickens stood, offering her hand. Thank you, miss, he said, for this and for what you're doing here. Not everyone dares to tend to the soldiers in a situation like this. She understood his meaning. South Carolina settlements were often occupied by Loyalist sympathizers. It's not courage, Anne said quietly. It's a necessity. Pickens smiled faintly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Sometimes those are the same things. Watching Pickens walk away, Anne felt more optimistic about Benjamin's safety. If he were to follow any leader into battle, she wanted it to be Colonel Andrew Pickens. That night, the camp was filled with an energy it hadn't felt in years. The men spoke of the militia leader and how they would join his troops to continue the fight. Benjamin found Anne among the crowd, his face streaked with dirt and his eyes bright. It's not over, Anne, he said, gripping her hands. We can't stop now, not when we've got a chance to win this war. Anne wanted to cry, to beg him to stay, but she knew the truth. None of them could stand still anymore. Go, she said. Fight for us. Just promise me you'll come back. He pulled her close. I will, he whispered. And when this is over, we will build something together. As he left with the others to join Pickens' forces, Anne stood in the clearing, watching the forest swallow them up. The war had taken so much from her, but it also had given her something, a new reason to fight, a love worth holding on to, and a glimmer of hope that freedom might be in their grasp. Chapter 5. A Shadow in the Trees. The raid at Mobley's meeting house would become a widespread, whispered tale of triumph in the weeks to come. Before the Mobley meeting house battle, much of the fighting in the North had ended, and the Patriots were struggling to control these territories. The once busy ports had been so heavily damaged by British troops that shipping was nearly halted. General Washington warned Congress that the North was in deplorable conditions and near ruin. A year later, he sent notice that he considered dissolving the Continental Army. The British were aware of the state of Washington's troops and deemed the North as good as conquered. Morale among the Patriots was low as they grew weary of the fight and the never-ending British soldiers arriving in more troops. The militiamen were in rags, their feet damaged from welts and infection. The rifles slung over the militiaman's shoulder wasn't polished like a musket, nor did it gleam with the shine of a well-kept officer's firearm. It was a long rifle, plain and sturdy, the kind a farmer might have propped behind the door to protect livestock. None of them had proper boots, and some had resorted to wrapping their feet in burlap with twine when their shoes gave out. The outlook for a victory was grim. The Southern campaign by the British had been somewhat successful when Savannah and Charlestown fell under Cornwallis. The new objective for the war in the South was to send out raids in every direction to civilians and plunder, burn homes, and destroy crops or livestock. The intent would be to drive the women and children of the Patriots to the swamps after the men were killed. Lord Cornwallis was commanded to hold control over the South Carolina, but he had his sights on Virginia. Convinced if he could take the state to the north, he could end the war. When he was confident of the stronghold over Savannah and Charleston, he sent some of his troops back into the backcountry of South Carolina, with the intent to have them flank north into North Carolina and then Virginia. In the heat of August 1780, Cornwallis troops regained a victory in Camden, South Carolina, under a young Lieutenant Colonel, Bannister Tarleton. Bannister was a war-thirsty dragoon leader known for his vicious nature. Wherever he roamed, they say horror and destruction followed. After the great defeat in Camden, General Washington sent his trusted friend, General Nathaniel Greene, to the Carolinas to try and save what was left of the Revolution. Greene chose a strategy to separate his forces and send General Daniel Morgan to South Carolina to try and intercept Tarleton's troops, creating a distraction. General Daniel Morgan was Daniel Boone's cousin and a true backwoodsman of Virginia. He had a reputation for being unruly, rough, consuming rum, and quick with his fist. Years earlier, Morgan did contract work under British General Braddock when he lost his temper on an officer and knocked him out with one punch. As punishment, he received 499 lashes that left deep scars and the respect from onlookers who couldn't believe he survived. Morgan took the punishment standing without losing consciousness and even counted along with the soldier inflicting the lashes. Although the lashes were to be 500, Morgan claimed he only counted 499. Afterward, Daniel Morgan returned to Virginia to farm his land. Going home wasn't much safer. During one Indian ambush, Morgan was shot in the back of his neck. The bullet went through the cheek and he lost his lower left teeth from it. This all happened before he celebrated his 23rd birthday. He was a prisoner of war after the storming of Quebec in the winter of 1775, where few survived the harsh conditions. When he finally reported back to General Washington in the spring of 1777, he only had 180 riflemen left in his commission. Impressed with the endurance and resolve of the young frontiersman, Washington formed a regiment of 500 men for Morgan to lead. He was to train these men to be rangers who would become disruptors to the British troops. Morgan was promoted to general and returned to the South in 1780. General Morgan's opponent was Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, a young graduate from Oxford and native of Liverpool. Besides his wealth, he was said to be a man of charm and intelligence who aspired to be a lawyer. When the Revolution started in the colonies, Tarleton found a new love for violence. His nature was such that he hated degeneracy and felt the colonists were ungrateful for the blessings their king had bestowed upon them. When the shots rang out in Concord and Lexington, Tarleton was so outraged he tossed aside his teachings of the law. "To hell with the law," he yelled. "Those miserable Americans must be taught their places." He used his influence to gain a commission in a cavalry regiment and sailed with Cornwallis to teach the unruly colonists a lesson. British leaders were so impressed with Tarleton's disciplined tactics towards the colonists that he was awarded a promotion to lieutenant colonel and put in command of the British Legion, a mixed force of cavalry and light infantry. Tarleton and his dragoons were hated throughout the Carolinas as they raided homes, killed husbands and sons, or destroyed their supplies, intending to starve them into submission. The bloodthirsty young commander did not follow rules like taking prisoners. Any Patriot sympathizer he found would meet their fate with his saber. Continental General Nathaniel Greene made the risky decision to split his forces in an attempt to outflank the enemy with this clear mission from General Washington. You will do everything in your power to distress the enemy and afford protection to the country. Annoying the British had been a specialty for Morgan and his men. They were experienced in hit-and-run tactics, harassing patrols, sniping at officers and scouts, and raiding their supplies. Morgan's sharpshooters were professional marksmen, and their long rifles often hiding in trees and ravines to surprise the British. Spies reported back to Cornwallis, who immediately took notice of Morgan's troops and their movements. He suspected Morgan might try to attack Augusta with his team of sharpshooters and rangers. Although Cornwallis wanted to stop Morgan himself, he couldn't leave his post with General Greene nearby, waiting for any sign of weakness. Instead, he sent word to his attack dog, Lieutenant Colonel Tarleton. Morgan was notified of British raiders between 96 and Winnsboro and rode towards the area, stopping at the country store there. Colonel Washington, cousin to George Washington, met Morgan there with his cavalry. The men were disgusted by the treatment of citizens by the British. They struck the loyalist raiders with the same ferociousness that Tarleton had shown. Of the 250 loyalists, only 60 managed to escape the slaughter. The Patriots did not lose a single man. The remaining 150 loyalists were butchered to send a message to Cornwallis and Tarleton. The war was not over yet. News of Morgan and Washington's massacre spread quickly, not only to Cornwallis, but all loyalists in the South. His chances of recruiting these young Southern loyalists was waning. Infuriated, Cornwallis sent Tarleton a message to find Morgan. "Wipe him out," he wrote. "Catch him and smash him." British Lieutenant Colonel Tarleton eagerly accepted his orders and pushed his troops forward to intercept General Daniel Morgan. By January 15th, 1781, Morgan learned of Tarleton's pursuit and wrote urgently to General Greene. "Tarleton has crossed the Tiger River. It is more than probable that we are his object. Tarleton's force is about 1,100 to 1,200 British troops." Morgan knew the odds were stacked against him. His men were exhausted. Forage for the horses was scarce, and the militia was in poor condition. He doubted his force could withstand Tarleton's well-trained army. The British commander was ruthless and aggressive. Morgan knew he would attempt a surprise attack which would destroy his troops. In his letter, Morgan even suggested it might be wiser to disappear into the swamps rather than face Tarleton head-on. He admitted his lack of confidence in the few hundred volunteers under his command, along with the cavalry and Washington's dragoons. Without enough grass, grain, food, or other supplies, victory seemed like a distant hope. But more troubling than the lack of resources was the challenge of keeping the volunteer militias organized and focused. Both were essential to any successful strategy. Anne heard the whispers swirling through the Mobley settlement, their voices heavy with fear. Of all the British commanders, none were more feared or more hated than Banastre Tarleton. Spies passed through with urgent news. Tarleton was closing in fast. Morgan was retreating towards the broad river, but he couldn't outrun the British forever. Soon he would have to turn and fight, and that meant Benjamin was in his path, and so were the Mobleys. Anne couldn't just sit by and wait. That morning she rose before the first light, slipping through the quiet house as the Cox family slept. Outside, her pony stamped restlessly as she saddled him. She packed what little food she could carry, stuffing her satchel with dried meat and bread. Herbs and bandages followed, medicine she might need if she found Benjamin wounded. Then, with one last glance towards the house, She swung onto the pony's back and rode into the dark forest. The morning mist still clung to the trees, wrapping the world in silence as she moved. Anne knew she had no choice but to follow the British and shadow their movements. Then she had to find a way past them to Morgan's camp. It was madness, reckless and dangerous, but she didn't hesitate. If Tarleton closed in on Morgan before he was ready, there would be no battle. There would only be a slaughter. By midday, she found the British Legion. From the cover of a rocky ridge lined with trees, Anne crouched low and watched as Tarleton's forces pressed forward. Even through the trees, the sight of them was enough to send her heart pounding. The redcoat regulars marched in perfect formation, their muskets gleaming and polished boots crushing the frozen earth beneath them. The mounted dragoons rode alongside, their sabers swaying. The British had artillery, proper training, and everything Morgan's men did not have. Tarleton pushed them harder still, barking orders, his officers shoving men forward with the butts of their muskets. He was driving them towards something, towards Morgan. Anne could see it in the way they moved, their forced march cutting straight towards the river, and that was her chance. Her fingers tightened on the reins, and she took a deep breath. If she made the wrong move, she would be caught. But she had spent years in these woods, learning their paths and hidden places. Anne knew how to move quickly without being seen. Pulling her cloak tight around her shoulders, she turned her pony and urged him forward, not toward the enemy, but around them, flanking their march, slipping through the trees like a shadow. Anne coaxed her pony. Faster. Branches whipped at her face. The cold air stung her lungs, but she didn't slow down. Anne had to reach the river first and get to Morgan before it was too late. Chapter 6. The Devil's March. Unlike Morgan's ragged militia, Tarleton's men were the very image of military precision. They were well-fed, equipped, and dressed in crisp, striking uniforms. Their regimental colors snapped proudly in the breeze, accompanied by sharp blasts of trumpets and the steady rhythm of drums. They marched with confidence of soldiers who believed themselves invincible, tight in formation, unwavering in discipline. They carried with them not just their weapons, but the full weight of the British military tradition, servants, polished gear, and an air of superiority that extended beyond their ranks. Yet beneath their impressive surface lay a force as brutal as it was efficient, driven by Tarleton's relentless ambition and ruthless tactics that had earned him both fear and infamy through the South. Morgan had no such luxuries. His force numbered just 900 men, tough, battle-worn fighters drawn from across the back country. His cavalry, led by Colonel William Washington, numbered barely more than 100. His best troops were the 290 Maryland Continentals under Williams, a skilled and steady commander. Supporting them were 2 companies of veteran Virginia militia, along with 140 Georgia militiamen hardened by years of partisan warfare. Morgan's plan had been to stay ahead of Tarleton, crossing the broad river and joining Greene's forces. But Anne knew now that Tarleton was closing the gap too quickly. She had to reach Morgan in time. Anne's breath was ragged, her hands numb on the reins as she rode through the dense underbrush. She was close now. In the distance, beyond the rolling hills, she could see the soft glow of fires, Patriot fires. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. A rustling in the trees sent a panic through her. Loyalist spies. 2 men stepped into her path, their rifles raised. "Where do you think you're going, girl?" one of them sneered. Anne yanked the reins, her pony skidding to a halt. The second man grabbed at her bridle, but before he could seize it, She drove her heels into the pony's side, jerking the reins hard. The animal reared, knocking the man off balance. Anne leaned low and charged past them, gunfire exploding behind her. She didn't stop. She couldn't. The trees thinned, and the warm glow of campfires grew brighter. Then came voices, harsh, commanding. Patriot sentries calling out into the night. "Halt! Who goes there?" Anne rode up, gasping, her hands shaking. The soldiers before her were lean and rough, their clothes mismatched, and their weapons steady as they pointed them at her. But thankfully, they were Morgan's militiamen. "I have information," she said quickly. "Tarleton, his troops, they're coming faster than you know. You have to take me to General Morgan." The sentries hesitated for a moment, exchanging looks in the flickering firelight. Then one of them, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard, stepped forward. "Come with me," he said. "If what you say is true, the general will want to hear it." Anne was led through the camp, past men huddled near fires, sharpening blades and tending to their muskets. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and sweat, a mix of quiet determination and exhaustion hanging over them. The soldiers who saw her pass watched with wary curiosity. A lone woman, a stranger, brought in under escort. Finally, she reached the largest tent, where the man guiding her pulled back the flap and gestured for her to enter. Inside, General Daniel Morgan stood over a crude wooden table, maps and letters spread before him. He was a broad-shouldered man, rough like the land itself, his face weathered but his eyes sharp with intelligence. Morgan glanced up as Anne entered, his expression empty. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice steady but edged with curiosity. "Who are you?" Anne swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand tall. "Anne Kennedy, sir. I was with the settlers near Mobley's meeting house. I've been tracking Tarleton's movements." Morgan raised an eyebrow and leaned slightly forward. "Tracking him?" "I followed his men for a day before flanking around them," she said, her voice gaining strength. "They're pushing hard, sir, faster than you think. They're marching towards the river, and you don't have much time." The tent went silent for a moment. Morgan studied her, then turned to the officer beside him. "Williams, wake the men. We move before first light." The officer nodded and strode out of his tent, his voice rising over the camp as he called out orders. Morgan's gaze returned to Anne, softer but skeptical. "You took a great risk coming here," he said. "You must have a reason." Anne hesitated only briefly. "I know men in your ranks," she admitted. "Colonel Pickinson's militia. Benjamin Cox is among them." Morgan's eyes narrowed slightly. Then he nodded, knowing his militiaman was a romantic interest. "Then you did them all a great service." He reached for a nearby flask and poured a measure of rum into a wooden cup, then handed it to her. "You look half frozen. Drink." Anne took it, her hands still trembling. She had never tasted alcohol before, but she sipped it. Morgan moved into the tent's entrance, looking over his camp. The battle was coming, and now, thanks to Anne, he knew just how close it was. Turning back, he gave her a grim but approving nod. "You got here just in time, Miss Kennedy," he continued. "I'm afraid I cannot let you leave now, though. You will stay here at the camp tonight and leave before sun rises. I can't afford for you to be captured by the British." At dawn, Morgan's scouts emerged from the dark forests, their horses lathered in sweat, bringing urgent news. Tarleton was only 5 miles away. What seemed like a short distance was often overlooked with the brutal reality of such marches. The British troops had not been given breaks and were being pushed to their limits. It was a constant, grueling hurry, grinding men down as they stumbled through the blinding darkness. There were ravines and tangled thickets, icy creeks and slick bog holes. Dense forests closed in on each side, and the rough ground twisted ankles and shattered cartwheels. The Carolina nights were bitter cold, and the dampness seeped into the bones. And there was fear, yes, even in the mighty British soldiers. The darkness itself seemed alive with it, the gnawing dread of enemies who could strike without warning and vanish just as fast into the woods. There was no comfort in the dark, only the endless irritation of men crowding blindly through the blackness, the shuffle of boots over roots and stones. The cold bit deep, and the plans kept changing, always changing. Morgan knew the stakes. Tarleton wasn't just 5 miles behind, he was hunting them. The survival of half of the Patriot forces in the South hung in the balance. Morgan understood one thing with absolute clarity. If Tarleton's cavalry caught him, it would be the end. Throughout the 16th, Morgan consulted with his guides and officers, weighing every option. Sometime in the afternoon, a messenger from Colonel Andrew Pickens arrived, breathless and mud-splattered. Pickens had gathered a force of mounted infantry, crossed the broad river, and was riding hard to join Morgan. But there was a problem. Pickens had not said where to meet. Morgan needed that information. He had to know. Other messengers trickled in, reporting that small detachments of mounted patriots, men gathered by Pickens but scattered along different trails, were also trying to link up with Morgan. None of them had clear orders on where to rendezvous. Morgan needed them, every last man. At the same time, spies watching Tarleton's advance rode in with grim news. Tarleton was not slowing down. He was pressing forward faster and harder, sending out patrols constantly to monitor Morgan's movements. Time was running out. The chase was nearing its end, and Morgan knew that soon there would be no more running. Chapter 7. Gathering at Cowpens. There was one place in the wild country known to every Patriot guide in both the Carolinas, the Cowpens. Major James McDowell, who now commanded the North Carolina militia under Morgan, had been among these men. Colonel Andrew Pickens knew the place well, too. All the Patriot militia did. South Carolina at the time of the Battle of Cowpens was a rugged and unforgiving land. Dense forests loomed over misty bogs, the mornings often cloaked in thick fog. The wilderness was dappled with winding rivers and creeks, each carving its path through the wild, their banks swelling with spring floods that turned trails into mires choked with thorns, rocks, and tangled briars. Winters brought a bone-chilling cold. This was a land as wild as it was relentless, where hardship was a constant companion, and the line between survival and ruin was tested daily. Morgan needed a place not just to fight, but to survive. It had to be somewhere Pickens and his men could find, even on the darkest night. A place with open ground for maneuvering, natural barriers for defense, and most crucially, forage for the horses and men. The answer was clear: Cowpens. There, wild cattle roamed freely. In the Carolinas, farmers marked their calves and turned them loose into the woods, sometimes not seeing them again for months. The cattle survived year-round in cowpens, on coarse, wild grass that grew thick and green, even in the winter. It was a blessing for hungry horses. The terrain was high, rolling country, sparsely forested, and free from treacherous swamps that blanketed the lowlands. Morgan had no love for swamps. Militiamen, when hard pressed, had an almost predictable urge to scatter into the swamps, more eager to escape to guerrilla fighting than to stand in formation. At Cowpens, there would be no swamps to run to, only ground to hold. Some of Morgan's officers questioned the choice. The field seemed too open, the flanks vulnerable. But in a close look at the maps, hidden strengths were revealed: streams, gullies, and bogs hemming it in like natural fortifications. The land rose gently, offering a clear view towards Thickety Mountain, with Mill Gap Road cutting straight through the center of the field. The ground was rough and uneven, scattered with chestnut, oak, and young pine. Brush, rocks, and tree stumps dotted the landscape, a battlefield as rugged and unpolished as the men who would fight there. It wasn't perfect, but Morgan saw its potential. He'd make it work. By mid-afternoon, it was clear to Morgan and his officers that they would never reach Broad River in time. The river lay 10 miles ahead, but Tarleton's cavalry patrols were already closing in. The British were too fast and too determined. Crossing the river would mean disaster. They'd be caught midstream, vulnerable and exposed. Morgan made his decision. "We'll go to Cowpens," he said firmly to his officers. "We'll be 5 miles closer to the river, and everyone knows where it is." Messengers from Colonel Pickens and the scattered groups of mounted riflemen were dispatched with urgent orders. "Return to your detachments and bring them to Cowpens immediately." The column shifted course, turning towards Thickety Creek, its winding banks leading the way to the chosen ground. Tarleton learned of Morgan's change of direction almost immediately. Having decided to make his stand at Cowpens, General Daniel Morgan, along with his trusted officers and guides, rode ahead of the column to survey the ground. They arrived late in the afternoon, the winter sun casting shadows across the open meadows. Before them stretched a wide, gently sloping expanse, dappled with scattered trees. The land rolled upward for the length of a pistol shot before dipping slightly and then rising again to a higher ridge. Perfect ground for what Morgan had in mind. Morgan dismounted and stood atop the gentle rise, his eyes sharp, scanning every detail of the landscape. He noted the shallow depressions scattered across the field, wolf pits, dug by local farmers to trap predators. A wry smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. These would do nicely. He understood his enemy well. Tarleton was aggressive to the point of recklessness, his confidence rooted in the discipline of his men and the sharp bite of their bayonets. But that very arrogance was a weakness that Morgan intended to exploit. Tarleton wouldn't advance cautiously. He'd charge headlong, expecting the militia to break and run. Morgan would let him believe that, drawing the British in deeper and deeper. Morgan pictured it clearly, British lines faltering as soldiers stumbled into the wolf pits, their formations shattering, momentum lost. Chaos would spread like wildfire. And when Tarleton's men were stretched thin and disorganized, Morgan's forces would strike from all sides, a double envelopment, swift and decisive. The battlefield itself was mostly level, but 2 small rises provided perfect cover to conceal his troops until the critical moment. The sparse trees and absence of thick underbrush meant a clear range with nothing to slow down musket volleys or cavalry charges. It was as if the land had been waiting for this very battle. Morgan's confidence grew with every step he took across the field. The land would be their greatest strength. Even the forgotten pits carved into the earth would play their part. Turning to his officers, he outlined his plan with the clarity of a man who knew exactly how to win. "We can trap 'em," Morgan finally said, his voice steady, filled with quiet authority. "We can lead 'em on, and when we've pulled 'em in far enough, we'll hit 'em with everything we got." He gestured across the open field, his eyes sharp with calculation. "Look here. We'll make camp in the valley, just behind that ridge. In the morning, we'll send the baggage to the rear towards the river. Make it look like we're getting ready to retreat." He paused. A grin flickered across his face. "That'll bait Tarleton right in." His officers leaned in, listening closely as Morgan mapped out the details. "We'll form 3 lines. The first line, sharpshooters, goes at the lower end of the slope. That's where Tarleton's men will break cover. They'll hit 'em with precision, then fall back fast. The second line, 100 yards behind the sharpshooters, will be militia. They'll fire 2 good volleys, then pull back 2. Tarleton will think we're running." Morgan's eyes gleamed with the thrill of the trap unfolding in his mind. "But we're not running. Not this time. See, behind the militia, up on that high ground, we'll have Colonel Howard's Maryland Continentals. Steady men, disciplined, ready to stand firm. And back here," he pointed to the hidden swale, "we'll have Colonel Washington's cavalry, waiting out of sight. When Tarleton's men charge in disorganized, thinking they've won, Washington's dragoons will sweep in from behind, cutting them down where they stand." Silence settled over the group for a moment, the weight of the plan sinking in. It was bold, it was risky, but it was brilliant. Morgan gave a final nod, his jaw set with determination. "It's a perfect trap." When his officers protested that such an arrangement would surely cause the militia to break and run at the sight of the British regulars, Morgan laughed, a deep, hearty sound full of confidence. "I'll tell 'em to run," he said, grinning as if he'd already won the battle. "But here's the trick. They'll be running on my orders." His officers exchanged uncertain glances. Morgan leaned in, eyes gleaming with that familiar spark of mischief and tactical brilliance. "If they're running because I told them to, they won't panic. They'll fall back in good order, straight to the shelter of Colonel Howard's Continentals on the second line. And to make sure they don't lose their nerve, I'll give them a little extra motivation," he chuckled. "I'll tell them the broad river's right behind us. That ought to keep them steady." A few of the men chuckled nervously, but one officer frowned, crossing his arms. "General, that leaves both our flanks exposed. In any formal battle, that's a fatal mistake." Morgan's smile didn't fade. He simply shook his head and slapped his thigh. "You're thinking like a textbook soldier, not like Tarleton." His tone grew sharp, cutting through the lingering doubt. "You know how he fights. I know how he fights. He's been chasing us for days. Tarleton's reckless, bold to the point of foolishness. He won't stop to think about flanks or formations. He's not coming here to outmaneuver us. He's coming to smash us, quick and hard, right through the center." Morgan paced a few steps, his boots crunching in the frost-covered grass. Then he turned back. "Morgan will rest his men tonight, just enough to keep them on their feet. Maybe give them a scrap of food, maybe not. Then he'll have 'em moving again by 3 o'clock in the morning, same as he always does. Tarleton don't change his stripes." The officers leaned in, hanging on every word now. Morgan's voice dropped lower. "It'll take him 4 hours to catch up to us. He won't hesitate when he does. He won't scout. He won't pause to form up his lines properly. He'll see our backs, think we're retreating, and charge straight ahead right into our trap." A few heads began to nod. Morgan could feel the shift in them, the doubt giving way to belief in his plan. He continued, "Why wouldn't he attack? He thinks he's got us outnumbered, thinks his troops are the finest light infantry in the British Army." Morgan's grin returned. "But that's exactly why we'll beat 'em. We'll hit 'em fast, hit 'em low, and when they break," he snapped his fingers, "they'll fall just as hard as the best of 'em did in Saratoga." Silence followed, thick with the weight of what was to come. Then slowly the officers nodded, first one, then another, until the entire group stood united. Morgan's plan was set, the trap was laid, and by the time the sun rose over Cowpens, history would be waiting. Chapter 8. Prepare for Battle. Anne lifted the coarse blanket that the men from the Virginia militia had piled over her as they hid her in the back of the commissary wagon. They knew General Morgan had ordered her to stay in camp for her safety, but when the sun rose, Anne refused to leave. "I'm not going anywhere," she told them, her voice stubborn despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "Not until Benjamin and Colonel Pickens's men arrive. I need to see them through this, all of them." The men understood. They admired her resolve, even though they thought it was reckless. Anne was more than just a presence. She had been a blessing the night before. She tended to blistered feet, patched torn uniforms, applied poultice to minor wounds, and even helped repair battered shoes with thread and leather scraps. The men grew protective of her, not just out of duty, but out of genuine respect. Dawn crept over the horizon, and Anne's restlessness grew unbearable. When the wagon stopped for a break, she slipped quietly from the back, her breath misting in the dark, cold morning air. She untied her pony from the side of the wagon, her fingers moving swiftly on the worn rope, and with a glance over her shoulder to make sure no one had noticed, Anne swiftly mounted and prepared to dart away. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to find Pickenson's militia and warn them. Digging in her heels, Anne rode towards the woods, slipping away undetected. The sounds of the marching soldiers faded behind her, replaced by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. The Cowpens camp for most of the night was a whirlwind of movement and noise. Mounted patrols came and went, delivering reports, while militia units trickled in at irregular intervals, their arrival marked by the noisy and chaotic energy. Before the night grew too cold, Andrew Pickens rode in with 150 mounted riflemen. Their presence bolstered the camp's numbers and their morale. That same cold, wet evening, Anne Kennedy arrived at Morgan's camp once again. She had found Pickens's militia tracking them through the damp wilderness and delivered her warning. Tarleton was moving faster than expected. The Mobley men welcomed her, grateful for the information she carried. Benjamin, however, was not as pleased to see her as she had hoped. "Anne, you shouldn't be here," he muttered under his breath as he took her by the arm, leading her away from the larger group. "And you think I could just sit there and wait?" she shot back, her voice low but firm. "Not knowing if you were dead or alive?" Benjamin sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. He knew better than to argue with her right now. Anne quickly relayed that she had overheard from Morgan's briefings the strategy, the formation, and the plan to lure Tarleton into a trap. She listed Tarleton's troops, their numbers, their weapons, and the terrain they would fight on. The wolf pits, the concealed swale, the way the land itself seemed to favor Morgan's plan. Her words, spoken in confidence, weren't just information, they were motivation. "Morgan knows what he's doing," she assured them, scanning the faces of the men who had fought so hard. "This isn't a fool's battle. You can win this." A quiet murmur spread among the gathered men, nods of approval passing between them. By the time Pickinson's men arrived at Cowpens, the camp was a muddy mess, wagons bogged down, the steady light rain making everything slick and miserable. Fires burned low, struggling against the damp, casting only feeble warmth. The men huddled near them, their breath visible in the frigid air. Tension clung to the camp. Tarleton was close, and everyone knew it. The South Carolina militia brought Ann straight to Morgan, finding him addressing a cluster of officers and men by a large fire near his tent. She was a striking sight, a strong, determined girl, no older than 18, with her pink cheeks flushed from the cold, and her blue knitted cap with the pink stripe pulled snug over her hair. Her arrival turned heads. The men, rough, hardened backwoods fighters, had seen more than their fair share of war, stopped their conversations, and watched as she approached. Ann's presence wasn't a surprise to Morgan. He had expected her stubbornness, but her courage was something else entirely. Morgan leaned on his cane and studied her for a long moment. He had seen men buckle under fear, had watched men run rather than fight. Ann Kennedy had ridden straight towards danger. "You've got more guts than some of the men I've commanded," he finally said, his voice rough but kind. He turned to one of the men near the fire. "Go get this girl something to eat, and see to it that she's looked after. You leave before dawn, understood?" The soldiers around them exchanged glances, their expressions shifting. She had braved the wild, defied orders, and risked capture, all to warn the Patriots. They respected it. Ann nodded in agreement with Morgan, still shivering from the cold, trying not to show weakness. Benjamin brought his blanket, covering her back with it. Pickens' militiamen cleared a log for her to sit on by a fire, giving her some bread and coffee. Ann nearly melted with the warmth of a blazing fire and the hot drink in her hands. Despite the crippling pain of sciatica and rheumatism that plagued him since the beginning of the campaign, General Daniel Morgan moved tirelessly throughout the camp, speaking with his men. He made sure every detachment understood its role, every rifleman knew where to stand, and every cavalryman was ready for the signal. Morgan had a knack for rallying troops, not through grand speeches or empty promises, but by making them mad. He was a rough backwoodsman himself, not much different from the hard-fighting, quick-tempered men under his command, and that's why they liked him and why they trusted him. As the misted rain continued to fall, soaking through cloaks and coats, Morgan stood firm, driving his men forward with the force of his will alone. Tomorrow they would fight, not for survival, but for victory. "Give these dragoons a chance at you," Morgan bellowed, "and they'll hack you and hang you." He turned to his aide, his voice sharp with command. "Here, Major, pull up my shirt. I want 'em to see what the British did to my back. They'll never get another chance at me." As the raw scars crisscrossing his back were revealed, murmurs spread through the ranks. This was no distant war story. This was their leader, standing before them, bearing the brutal marks of the British cruelty. Morgan tucked his shirt back in, his eyes fierce as he faced them again. "I'm putting a line of North Carolina men way down front," he told them. "And right alongside 'em, I'll put the same number of South Carolina. And you're always bragging about how you can outshoot everyone else. Well, here's your chance to prove it. The rest of us will be watching. Let's see you get mad and shoot straight." His voice grew even louder, cutting through the cold morning air. "These damn British have burned your homes, slaughtered your cattle, stolen your chickens, and and scared the hell out of your women folk. And right here is where you do something about it." Morgan's men, already fired up, listened as he laid out the plan. "All we need from you is 2 shots apiece. Just 2. That'll be plenty. Hold your fire till they're 50 paces away. Then let 'em have it. Now, every one of you claims you can hit a squirrel at 50 paces. Well, you could fit 10 squirrels into Tarleton's helmet." The men chuckled. "Get behind trees if you want. Rest your rifles on anything you can find. Lie down if it helps you shoot straighter. Just make damn sure you hit what you're aiming at. Fire twice, then get up and run. Run straight back to Colonel Pickinson's line. He'll be waiting behind you, and he won't fire till you've passed through. Now retreat in good order, because we don't want to have to shoot you for being too slow or for too fast." A rough laugh rippled through the men, and some nudged each other in the ribs, muttering big talk about how they'd dropped more than just 2 shots before they pulled back. Morgan was rough with them, but that's what they needed. "You want to be careful about running," he warned, his tone half mocking, half deadly serious. "Don't run farther than you're told. Broad River is right behind us, and if Tarleton chases you into it, you'll get wet." The men laughed, but the warning stuck. In truth, the Broad River was over 5 miles behind Morgan's line, and Morgan knew it. But keeping the militia convinced the river was close served a purpose. It gave him a reason to stand their ground. Morgan shook his fists at them, a wild grin spreading across his face as he moved along to rally the next group. "Look for the epaulets," he shouted. "Pick off the epaulets! Get rid of the epaulets!" The men nodded. They understood. On the battlefield, those bright, gleaming gold or silver epaulets were more than decorations. They were the beacons of leadership. Morgan knew that if his riflemen could strike down the British officers and sergeants, the tightly disciplined enemy ranks would falter. With their chain of command shattered, even the best British troops would be easier to break. The men weren't just preparing for war, they were preparing to hunt. And when the battle began, the British wouldn't even realize that they were the prey. Chapter 9. Campfire Stories. The camp at Cowpens settled into an uneasy quiet as the night fell and the fires burned low. Anne sat between Benjamin and the Mobley men, who kept a quiet but steady watch over her. She had no intention of sleeping. As the night stretched on, the men around the fire spoke in hushed voices, sharing stories of war and the scars that had left on their homeland. "We wasn't much for reading or writing, most of us," one of the older militiamen murmured, shifting his rifle. "Our clothes were homespun, patched so many times there wasn't much left to patch. But we got by. And then the war came. The folks split, King's men against congressmen, Tory against Patriot. And let me tell you, the Tories didn't fight fair." He spoke of Bloody Bill Cunningham, who led raiding parties through the upcountry, burning farms and shooting down whole families as they fled their homes. "Cunningham got away, last I heard, but the scars he left, those ain't going nowhere." The men nodded in agreement. The upcountry was like that. Neighbors turning on neighbors, brothers against brothers. Every time a man saddled up, he kept one on the reins and the other hand on his rifle. A younger soldier bitterly chuckled. "Them Charleston folks, they called us the absolute scum of the earth. Them low country gentry with their silk coats and fancy words, but I tell you, it was us scum that won the French Indian War for 'em." Another man spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "After 78, the war up north was mostly done, but down here it was hell. The British took Charleston in 80, and Cornwallis thought he had the South wrapped up like a Christmas goose. I'll never forget Camden. Patriots butchered, bodies laying along the road for miles. The fire crackled softly. The mention of Nathaniel Greene brought murmurs of approval. Now there's a man. Funny thing, ain't it? A Quaker, supposed to be all peace and no fight, turned out to be one of the best generals we ever had. Nathaniel Greene fought smart, and that's why we're here at Cowpens, waiting for Tarleton. The speaker exhaled slowly. We didn't have much. No fine words, no polished boots. But we had grit, and sometimes that's all it takes to win a war. A younger militiaman turned to Anne. Let me tell you about Pickens. Have you ever heard of the wizard owl and the swamp fox? Anne shook her head. Others in the circle grinned, already knowing what was coming. The man took a slow breath, his voice dripping into the steady rhythm of an old storyteller. Well, down in the eastern end of South Carolina, there was a man you'd swear was born from the swamp, Francis Marion. They called him the Swamp Fox, and it wasn't just talk. Marion drank vinegar straight from the tin cup and led his men through places most folk wouldn't dare set foot in. If you didn't know the hidden paths, you'd sink up to your neck in water and mud before you took 10 steps. But Marion and his men, they glided through like ghosts, riding only at night, their faces blackened with soot. They'd strike before the British even knew they were there. One moment, everything was still. The next, Marion's men burst from the trees, rifles cracking, blades flashing, and then vanished before the enemy could even aim their muskets. They even had a song, one they sang under their breath to keep their spirits high. We ride, we hide, we fight again, for we are Marion's men. Now Marion wasn't alone in all this. There was another man, different, but just as deadly, Andrew Pickens. Where Marion was sly and slippery, Pickens was calculated and commanding. Together they made a team that kept the British scrambling, two sides of the same coin. If you heard the Swamp Fox's name, you'd hear the Wizard Owl's name in the same breath. They fought smart, they fought hard, and they never fought fair. The British hated them for it. Marion for his elusiveness and Pickens for his precision. Cornwallis himself called them the devil's pair, and he wasn't far off. Pickens once told his men, "You fight like gentlemen if you want. We'll fight to win." And they did. The militiaman leaned back, arms crossed, his eyes flickering in the firelight. "So don't you worry about Benjamin," he told Anne with a grin. "Ain't no man safer than one riding under Pickens." Anne nodded, the tension in her chest easing just a little. The fire crackled, the night deepened, and the stories carried on, one after the other, as the men waited for morning and the battle that would decide everything. Another man shifted on his haunches, warming his hands. He turned to Anne with his own story. Now Bannister Tarleton, Banny, Morgan used to call him, he's a different kind of beast. Cavalryman, sharp as a blade and just as cruel. The men around the fire listened intently as he went on. Came out of Liverpool, bought his commission like most of them, but he earned his reputation in blood. 26, 27 at best, but he rides like he owns the place. Had 1,000 men at his back, green coat dragoons, Highlanders from the 71st, and King's men who'd sold their souls for a few coins. The speaker's voice dropped lower. We was all scared white of him. All of South Carolina was. He wasn't just fighting, he was butchering. Waxhaws proved that plain enough. A hush settled over the group. Everyone knew what happened there. Patriots cut down even after they surrendered. Sabers flashed, blood soaked the ground until it turned to mud. That was pure hate. Tarleton wasn't no fool, though. He's fast, always one step ahead. Half the time you heard he was coming, it was just rumors. But sometimes it wasn't. And when it wasn't, God help you if you weren't ready. The man exhaled, his breath curling in the cold night air. They called him Bloody Ben, and he earned it. A soldier came to update them on formations, and the militiaman by the fire nodded, rubbing his hands together. Getting back to our lineup. Some say we got 970 men. Ain't sure how they counted, but however many we are, we ain't no regular army. He began ticking them off on his fingers. 400 Marylanders, tough as hickory, led by John Howard, good man, steady under fire. 100 Virginians with him, another 150 Georgians, fresh, but they're ready. He smirked, gesturing towards himself. And then there's us. 300 backcountry militia under Pickens. Farmers mostly. No uniforms, no proper boots, just what we could carry. The man chuckled. And me? Just a poor farmer wearing boots I've patched a dozen times. Toting an old rifle that's seen better days. But I'm here. And I'm standing with you fine gentlemen ready to face Tarleton and his green coat devils. He grinned at Ann and leaned against a pine tree. Colonel Pickens had about 300 of us that day I signed on as an ostler, taking care of the horses. Not much of a soldier, but Pickens didn't seem to mind. The men chuckled. One nudged another and mentioned a lanky figure by the fire. See that tall one cleaning his musket? Deadeye Hughes. Over 6 feet tall, thin as a rail. Could hit a turkey's eye at 100 paces. But don't let him run. You hear that limp a mile away. Another nodded towards a man with a crooked finger and an ever-watchful eye. Well, that's Cherokee Jim Savage, raised by the Indians. Knows the woods better than most men know their own farms. The boy with the fiddle got a nod. Jim Foley. We call him the fiddler. White-haired as an old man, but barely old enough to shave. A man scratching furiously at his arm let out a curse. And that Scratchy Simon. Poor bastard. Been fighting the bloody flux for weeks. The storyteller leaned back, folding his hands behind his head. And me? They call me Hawkeye. Grew up in the woods, in the mountains. Got an eye for distance. Can't say I'm the best shot, but I'm good enough to earn the name. He turned to Anne, his grin softening. We're a rough bunch, miss. Ain't no Charleston fancies here, but we know how to fight. And when the time comes, we'll stand our ground. The fire crackled low, and the men sat in silence, each one lost in thought as the night stretched towards dawn and the battle that waited. Chapter 10. Early Morning Frost. The men had been in dire straits before Cowpens, their spirits battered by hunger and bitter cold. The meat had long run out, leaving them to survive on scraps of rice, dried corn, sweet potatoes, and colewort. Some mixed their last drops of rum with sugar and water, hoping to warm themselves from the inside out. Shoes had been worn through. Many had none at all, wrapping raw, frostbitten feet in rags. One thin blanket had to serve 4 men. Their rifles and muskets, though cherished lifelines, felt heavy in the damp cold as the wind sliced through their makeshift camp. None of them had touched the king's coin in years, and they knew the price of freedom, shivering in the dark, hungry and cold, waiting for the fight that would decide their fate. The moon emerged around midnight, cold and pale, casting a dim glow over the restless camp. Around 2 a.m., a howling wind swept from the mountains, sharp and biting, rattling the trees and bending them. The wind gusts worked on the men's nerves, and no one slept well. The ground was damp, the wind relentless, and the fear clung to the camp. The ostlers moved constantly through the horses, checking straps, tightening girths, their movements quick and anxious. Men whispered in low tones, their voices lost in the wind. The trees groaned, Their branches swayed, creaking like they could snap at any moment. Every sound seemed sharper and more urgent. The threat of Tarleton and his dragoons hung over the camp. At 3 o'clock in the morning, as the last pickets were called in, Tarleton's forces began their advance. His troops, hardened and eager for battle, followed the path Morgan's army had taken the night before. Behind them, the baggage and wagons remained under guard, waiting for daylight. 3 companies of light infantry led the way, supported by the Legion's infantry. The 7th Regiment, the field guns, and the 1st Battalion of the 71st Highlanders made up the center. The cavalry and mounted infantry brought up the rear. The march was slow and grueling. The ground was uneven, riddled with creeks, deep ravines, and tangled brush. Every step forward meant stopping to check the flanks and scout the terrain. The British had loyalist backwoodsmen to guide them, men who knew the Carolina wilderness like the back of their hands. But even with their knowledge, progress was painfully slow. By the time they reached Thickety Creek, the darkness had begun to lighten into a faint pre-dawn gloom. The water was cold as ice, and men stumbled through it, boots sinking into the mud, rifles held high. Ahead of them, an American patrol was spotted. Tarleton wasted no time. "Run them down." 2 troops of dragoons surged forward, hooves pounding through the half-frozen earth. The American scouts barely had time to react before the cavalry was on them. Some managed to flee, vanishing into the trees. Others were overtaken and cut down before they could warn Morgan's camp. The British march continued, but now Tarleton knew Morgan wasn't running anymore. He was forming up, and a battle was coming. Through the long, dark hours, Tarleton's men had pressed forward at a relentless pace. 4 hours of marching, their boots soaked, their bodies aching, and their tempers burning hotter with every mile. They wanted blood. Tarleton himself had stoked their fury. He knew his men were frustrated with the chase. Morgan had eluded them too many times, striking fast and disappearing. The British commander fed their anger, urging them forward with the promise of payback. Among his officers, there was no doubt they wanted Morgan dead. A British major would later write that the Carolina backwoodsmen were more savage than the Indians, possessing all their vices but none of their virtues. Tarleton's men had begun to see Morgan the same way. They hated him, hated his sharpshooter's tactics, hated his ability to vanish into the hills, his militia striking like ghosts before melting back into the trees. And now, at last, they had him cornered. Tarleton's green-coat dragoons gritted their teeth, their swords slick with the damp morning air. The Highlanders tightened their grips on their muskets. They had waited long enough. It was time to put an end to Morgan's rebellion. Chapter 11. The battle begins. Anne followed the slope of the hill, her breath catching as the trees thinned and revealed the wooden platform perched atop the rise. It was a simple thing, barely more than a scaffold of rough-hewn logs, but it offered a commanding view of the fields below. "It was used to watch the cattle from up here," Benjamin said, gesturing to the open ground. "You will be out of sight here. Take off your cap. It's too colorful." He was visibly rattled by the impending battle and keeping her safe. Anne grabbed his hand and held it tight. "Do not concern yourself with me, Benjamin." Her voice was a comfort. "My pony is behind the hill. If I see danger, I ride out of here. You know I can do this." Benjamin softened. Yes, he knew. If anyone could outrun Tarleton, it was Anne. He held her tight and waved goodbye. Anne climbed up the logs and parked herself on the platform, taking off her beloved cap as she replaced it with a dark wool blanket Benjamin had left for her. From the lookout, Anne could see the expanse of the Cowpens, a patchwork of grazing land and woods dotted with hills and gullies. It was the kind of place that seemed peaceful, but she knew better now. War had a way of creeping into the quietest corners. Sleep was a fleeting luxury, and by 6 a.m., most of the men were stirring, rubbing stiff joints, and shaking off what little rest they managed to steal. Quiet and grim, they stumbled through the fog, their breath visible in the cold air. The mood was anxious for what the day might bring. By the time the gray light fully claimed the camp, each man was in his place, steadying himself for the fight. The sun rose on January 17th, 1781, a few minutes after 7 a.m. An hour before that, in the gray dawn, all of Morgan's men were on the move, eating breakfast cooked the night before, piling their belongings on the baggage wagons. The wagons jolted off to the rear and vanished among the trees. The mounted militia tied their horses in the places vacated by the wagons, and Washington's white-coated cavalry lined up in the swale behind the hill. Morgan had already taken post there with his aide and his other mounted officers. "Move fast," Morgan urged them hoarsely. "Our pickets are driven in. Move out on the double. Get yourselves into position." The Cowpens was noisy with the shouts of officers. The two groups of Georgia and South Carolina sharpshooters, 150 in all, herded by their leaders Cunningham and McDowell, ran from the swale and down to the far bottom of the first slope. There, the men seemed to vanish in the dim light as they hid themselves as best they could in the rough grass and behind scattered trees. In front of Morgan, a little downhill from him, was his main line of 290 reliable Marylanders, reinforced on the right by 150 Virginia and Georgia militia with their captains. Between the main line and the advanced group of unseen sharpshooters, and spread out in the open order on the lower of the two hills, was Colonel Pickens's South Carolina Volunteers. With lines thus formed, the whole of that long meadow was silent, watchful, and cold beneath the yellow light coming in from the east. Quarter of an hour before sunrise, the first rays of dawn delivered golden light over Thickety Mountain and pierced through the frost-laden air. The camp was silent, every man in the first line of sharpshooters lying low, hidden behind trees, rocks, and bush. They were Pickett's first-line militia, carefully positioned for their skill and precision. Their task was clear: strike first, disrupt the British advance, and draw them in. Morgan had chosen the ground well. The first line was strategically placed around the old wolf pits, deep concealed traps dug long ago to catch predators prowling the countryside. These pits, hidden beneath a thin layer of brush and leaves, now served a new purpose, ready to trip up an advancing cavalry. The sharpshooters crouched along the edges, knowing the terrain would do as much work as their rifles when the time came. The green-coated dragoons emerged from the woods, their horses slow and steady. Steam rose from the animals' nostrils as they moved through the morning mist, their riders scanning the terrain with an air of confidence. They had no idea what lay ahead. Sharp eyes and steady hands hidden among the rocks and trees, wolf pits waiting like silent mouths beneath the frost. The sharpshooters waited, rifles steady, their fingers brushing the cold metal of their triggers. Each man's target was clear: the officers or the sergeants, and the men with gold and silver epaulets. They pressed themselves low to the ground, ready to unleash the first volley when the time was right. Hawkeye crouched low, his breath visible in the crisp morning air, his rifle cold in his hands. General Morgan's orders echoed in his mind. Wait until they're close enough. Aim for the epaulets. Take out the leaders. It was all about timing. One wrong move, one eager shot too soon, and the plan could unravel. Cherokee Jim lay beside him, calm despite the twitch in his eye. "Hawkeye," he muttered, his voice low. "We've been through worse fixes. Take it slow. Don't get 'em in an uproar." The words steadied him, though his hands felt clammy against the stock of his rifle. The sun was bright now, straight in their eyes, and it bounced off the dragoon's brass helmet up ahead. Hawkeye squinted, unable to see the man clearly, but then more of them appeared, emerging from the trees in a long, thin, curved line. The 71st Scott Highlanders were there, their tartans and kilts catching the light. Behind them came the British regulars, their scarlet coats trimmed in green, the brass on their helmets shining in the dawn's light. Two dragoons trotted forward in a slow, deliberate pace, shouting, "Hello! Hello!" as if mocking the hidden Patriots. Then their cannons, small and quick to fire, started popping. Grasshoppers is what they were called. The sharp crack of each shot rolled across the field like distant thunder. Hawkeye waited, his finger poised but still. The line drew closer, and the tension nearly unbearable. 50 yards. It was time. When the first shots rang out, they struck true. 20, maybe 30 of them went down, horses collapsing. The rest of the dragoons scattered their lines, breaking in confusion. The horses were big targets, easy to hit, but every man focused on the epaulets, glinting in the sunlight, marking officers and sergeants. Hawkeye sighted an officer, the epaulette clear against the scarlet coat. The barrel of his rifle felt freezing against his cheek, but he squeezed the trigger, and the officer jerked back, a surprised look flashing across his face before he slumped and disappeared into the chaos behind him. Hawkeye didn't stop to think. He reloaded his gun, hands steady now, ready for the next target. Around him, the first line of sharpshooters moved like a machine, each man firing, reloading to take another shot, and then falling back as the British advanced, just as General Morgan ordered. The plan was working, but the fight had only just begun. 50 green jacket cavalrymen pressed into the open. They spread out wide and pounded up the meadow towards the sharpshooters' positions. More ragged puffs of smoke rose from the grass. A cavalryman fell from his horse. 3 more cavalrymen were pitched from their saddles, and half a dozen riderless horses cantered across the field. The sharpshooters rose from the grass, and the cavalry group halted and wheeled. As they cantered back, men climbed from their saddles to catch horses and help those who had been shot. Morgan's riflemen were trained to reload while running across a broken field and hit a saucer at a distance of 100 paces. The British, however, had to come to a stop in order to reload. So while they reloaded, standing still, the Unions hit them again. Half of the British officers went down. Those who were left urged their men forward, and the Carolinians, having fired twice, as Morgan requested, got to their feet and ran, causing Tarleton to mistake it for a retreat. The Carolina militias moved quickly to their left, circled the hill on which Morgan stood. There, in the safety of being hidden, the militia reloaded their rifles and prepared for the next level of Morgan's plan. This militia movement looked to the British line and the troop of cavalry advancing abreast of the running militia like panic. Unorganized retreats were expected from militiamen when they saw the might of the British forces. The cavalry troop put spurs to their horses and galloped after the retreating militia, who increased their speed, leading Tarleton's cavalry into the second line. Tarleton ordered his troops to pursue them, believing the Americans were retreating in disarray. His troops charged ahead to the second line. Hawkeye later recounted the scene. The second line boys gave us a funny look as we scrambled back to their position, breathing hard and nerves frayed. They were lying low, rifles at the ready, their faces set with determination. I ducked behind a rock next to a Georgie boy wearing a bright red knit cap. I never caught his name, but he turned to me with a grin, reached his eyes, and said, "Boy, I hope they learnt you how to shoot." The British kept coming. It wasn't a pretty sight. The bagpipes wailed their eerie tune over the battlefield, mixing with yells of charging soldiers and screams of men and horses that were struck down. Some of the wounded horses ran wild, eyes rolling, while others collapsed where they stood, tangling with riders who couldn't get clear. The sharp tang of gunpowder filled the air thick and choking, and the gray haze of smoke hung low over the ground. Sweat ran down our faces as we fired and reloaded, hands shaking but steady enough to aim. The battlefield was a mess of bumps from the cannons, the screams of wounded men and animals, commands from officers, and curses flying through the chaos. Smoke billowed everywhere, stinging our eyes and blotting out the sun. Through it all, those cursed bagpipes kept playing. We were scared, every one of us, but we held on. There wasn't much choice. The British were bearing down, and the second line had to stand firm if there was any hope of stopping them. The faux retreat of the Carolina militia at Cowpens was anything but orderly. While the plan called for the men to fire their 2 shots and fall back deliberately to the next line, chaos quickly took hold. Some fled outright, running as fast as their legs would carry them, and few even reached their horses and vanished into the wilderness. Lieutenant Hughes, a man of remarkable strength and lightning fast on foot, became a force of desperation and determination. When his men broke ranks and fled before facing Tarleton's advancing cavalry, Hughes sprinted past them with his sword drawn, spinning to face them. His voice, sharp and commanding, cut through their panic. "You damn cowards, halt and fight! If you don't stop and fight, you'll all be killed!" His words were not enough at first. The men, overwhelmed and disoriented, continued to scatter, deaf to his commands. But Hughes refused to give up. He pursued them relentlessly, outpacing even the fastest of the fleeing men, then cutting them off to face them. With strikes of his blade and booming orders, Hughes forced them to regroup. Finally, on the brow of the slope behind the clump of young pines, Hughes managed to hold his men together. The trees offered some concealment and protection from the relentless dragoons. Others, seeing this stand, joined them for their safety. The militiamen reloaded their guns quickly, their hands steadier now, and their breaths calm. Panic gave way to resolve, and they found their footing once again. Chapter 12. A Double Envelopment. The 2 field pieces in the center of the British line thereupon opened on Maryland and Virginia troops on the hilltop, and the half-officered British line, screaming encouragement to each other, ran helter-skelter up the hill to bayonet the remainder of the Americans. Morgan, Williams, and the other Patriot officers waited until the militia were safely out of their line of fire, then bellowed the word the regulars had been waiting for. "Fire!" The sudden fire from the force of the Continentals put an end to the British intentions of using their bayonets. They came to an abrupt halt, and for 10 minutes the British line exchanged a thunderous return fire with the Marylanders and Virginian Continentals. At 9:15 a.m., as the British advanced on Howard's Continentals, Morgan's militiamen turned and unleashed a devastating counter volley. British soldiers were caught in confusion, with many failing to fire their muskets. From a distance, Tarleton watched as the British line wavered and stopped. Knowing they were in trouble, he instantly called on his reserve. He ordered Fraser's Highlanders to march forward and hit the weak Virginia militia who were fighting beside the Maryland Continentals, while he led his dragoons and made a wide circle around the Highlanders to flank the American line and squeeze it to death between the Highlanders and himself. When the advance squadron of dragoons had charged the militiamen who were retreating as ordered, watchful Washington had put his cavalry into motion and galloped out of the swale, hitting the British dragoons head-on, sending them flying. He then turned his troops and galloped back to the swale. Streaming behind him came the fleeing militiamen. William Washington's cavalry flanked the British, cutting down dragoons attempting to flee. In the swale, Pickens, assisted by Morgan, Washington, and Hughes, brought the militia to a stop, reformed them into companies, bawling reassurances at them until their anger against the British and their confidence in their victory was once again restored. The occurrences of the following quarter hour were rapid, violent, unexpected, and to Tarleton, catastrophic. The Maryland Continentals, with the Virginia militia on their right, were on the slope of the larger hill when Fraser's Highlanders were ordered forward to strike their right flank. Howard commanded both Marylanders and Virginians. To protect himself, Howard sent word to the Virginians to turn at right angles to the line and face the Highlanders. The order required that the Virginians turned completely around so they faced to the rear, then wheel in a quarter circle so they faced left. Instead of that, the Virginians mistook their orders, about-faced, and instead of wheeling, started straight for the rear. The Continentals, seeing this movement, thought the Virginians were carrying out an order to retreat to a higher second position, marked by Morgan the night before. So the Continentals about-faced as well, and also marched to the rear abreast of the Virginians. Both Howard and Morgan thought the other ordered the move. It looked valuable, so Morgan let it continue, galloping across the front line, warning all officers to have their men prepared to wheel, turn, and fire instantly when the order was given. One militiaman later gave his account of what happened, ordered us to turn around and face them, but the orders got muddled. Instead of turning, we started trotting back. When the other men saw us pulling back, they thought we were retreating, and the whole line started to fall back. And that's when Morgan came storming over, gripping that little turkey call of his and demanding to know what was going on. He told Howard to follow him, saying he'd pick a better spot for us to turn. And when we reached it, Howard ordered us to stop and turn around. And this is the part I'll never forget. I don't know if it was one man or a dozen who turned first, but suddenly about 100 of us on the right wheeled around. The British were only 20 yards away, close enough that we couldn't miss. We fired all at once, and the volley hit them like cannons firing. The rest of the line, hearing the shots, turned to see what was happening. Howard shouted, "Give 'em the bayonets, boys!" And we charged. I ran at a Tory, ready to stick him, but he turned and bolted, tripping over himself as he tried to get away. There was a hell of a fight over the grasshoppers, those little cannons the British brought. Men were screaming and yelling. The sun was out now, and the cold, wet ground was slippery as ice. I saw Copperhead Williams twist his leg so badly we had to put him in a horse later. Scratchy got his pants ripped clean down one leg and cursed loud enough to make the angels blush. Deadeye, of all people, managed to cut himself with his own knife. Most of the Tory troops just sat right down where they were, their faces white as ghosts. The ones who ran moved like stampeding cattle, scattering in every direction. It all happened so fast. The British had come on like a mob, thinking the fight was already won, and they didn't know what hit 'em. When we turned around and struck back, Billy Washington went after Tarleton himself and chased him down, but Tarleton managed to slip away. In the same moment, Pickens' South Carolina militia reformed, rested, their rifles reloaded, and they poured out of the swale where they had retreated, shooting at the remaining British until they surrendered. Banastre Tarleton, once so assured of victory, found himself in chaos of defeat, his forces crumbling around him. The disciplined ranks of his dragoons had vanished, scattering in fear and confusion as the Patriot counterattack swept through the battlefield. He had ordered his cavalry to reform, to hold their ground, to stem the tide of retreat, but they would not listen. No command, no threat, no rallying cry could pull them back into formation. The proud British Legion, once an unstoppable force, now abandoned their commander, leaving Tarleton to watch in bitter disbelief as his artillerymen made a desperate last stand. Even as he struggled to regain control, the weight of the loss bore down on him. His cavalry had fled, his infantry was shattered, and worst of all, Cornwallis was nowhere to be found. The support he had expected, the reinforcements, Cornwallis could have salvaged the battle, but they were over 25 miles away. With no choice left, Tarleton turned his horse south, riding hard towards Hamilton's Ford, his mind racing with the weight of the failure. The legend of Tarleton's invincibility had been broken at Cowpens. As the thunder of gunfire was reduced to sporadic pops, it was an indicator that the battle had been won. The aftermath of the explosive violence was gruesome. The wolf pits that aided in Morgan's strategy lay hidden beneath the roots of towering oaks, the caverns jagged with rocks and masked by leaves, branches, and water. Shouts echoed across the clearing as men struggled to drag bodies through the muck. Wounded soldiers screamed in pain, their cries cutting through the grim silence, while others sat motionless on the ground, their faces blank with surrender. Chapter 13: The Spoils of War. Riderless horses bolted, their hooves kicking up the mud as they galloped in a panic to escape. The pits began to fill, the bodies landing haphazardly, some face down, their backs hunched, others staring up, their blank eyes reflecting the brilliant sunlight. The stark reality of death seemed to clash with the serene beauty of the winter sky that day, as if it were all just a dream. The soldiers who tended to the dead moved mechanically, their faces drawn tight, their hands numb from the cold and the weight of their task. Decades later, for those who had witnessed the aftermath, the memory of the pits remained sharper than any weapon. The image of that sunlit battlefield and the lifeless figures in the shadows below was haunting. The entire battle was fought in an hour, and in that time, according to Morgan, the British Legion under Tarleton lost 110 men, with 200 wounded and over 500 taken prisoner. Tarleton, with his few faithful cavalrymen, burned as much of his luggage as he could, but even so, Morgan's men captured 800 muskets, 2 3-pound cannons, 60 servants, and 100 cavalry horses, 35 wagons with all the baggage and colors of the 7th Regiment, and 1 traveling forge, and the band's musical instruments to be played in future battles to anger Cornwallis. Morgan quickly moved his army and prisoners across the broad river to avoid pursuit by Cornwallis. Cornwallis, after Cowpens' battle, burned his heavy luggage and transformed his entire army into light troops so they could set out at top speed to overhaul and destroy both Morgan and Greene. Tarleton, having formed his British Legion, continued to be Cornwallis's eyes and ears in this race across North Carolina and into Virginia. Colonel Pickens rounded up his militiamen, and the Mobleys and Benjamin didn't rest before they were marching again. As they filed into line, Benjamin caught a glimpse of Anne on the hill. She sat proud on her pony, looking down over the victory. He smiled as she rode away. Soon he would see her again, and they would build their lives in this land he and his brothers in arms were protecting. To keep Anne from trying to follow him again, Benjamin wrote often to inform her and his family of his progress. June 1781, Augusta, Georgia. Dearest Anne, at last Augusta is ours. For 2 weeks we laid siege to the fort, cutting off the enemy's supplies, firing upon them day and night. Yesterday they surrendered. It was a sweet victory, for this land is ours, not theirs. General Pickens has led us well, and I thank the Lord I still stand to write you these words. When will I see you again? Soon, I pray, Benjamin. Autumn started to creep in, and time kept moving. Anne tried to be patient, but the months continued. Another letter arrived. September 10th, 1781, near Utah Springs, South Carolina. Dear Anne, we fought again 2 days past at Utah Springs. It was a hard battle, and though the British held the field at the end, we broke them. They have lost too much, and they know it. Soon they will leave our land for good. I saw more friends fall. Thomas Mobley died next to me. I pray their souls find peace. As for me, I am alive, and that is enough for now. It will be more than enough when I return home. Hold on for a little longer. I will return to you. Forever yours, Benjamin. The last letter arrived mid-October, just as the crisp autumn air hinted at winter's return. Anne read it over and over, tracing Benjamin's words with her fingers, holding them close in quiet moments before dawn. It was all she had of him. He was alive somewhere out there. Chapter 14, Freedom. The war dragged on, and though Anne tried to stay hopeful, doubt gnawed at her. Would Cornwallis come storming back, burning and pillaging, taking revenge for all the Patriots had done? Would Benjamin make it home? She didn't know. She only knew she had to be ready for anything. So Anne focused on what she could control. She filled the days as best she could, gathering herbs by the creek, drying them in careful bundles, and tucking them away for whatever the future might bring. One morning, before the stars had fully faded, Anne woke with a start. She had dreamed of Benjamin standing in the doorway. His boots were caked in mud, his uniform torn, but his eyes shone with something she hadn't seen in years: peace. For a moment, in the hazy space between sleep and awake, she believed it. Anne reached out, but the cabin was silent and dark. The hearth was cold, and the war was still real. With a sigh, she rubbed her eyes and pulled on her skirts, fastening the buttons of her boots with slow, deliberate movements. That's when she heard it. A muffled voice outside, a man shouting. Her heart pounded. Anne rushed to the door and flung it open. The morning air hit her face, but she hardly noticed. Straining to listen, she caught the voice again. She snatched the rifle from beside the door, slipping like a shadow through the woods, her feet flying over the damp earth. A voice, hoarse but familiar, rose in the morning air, carrying a tune she almost recognized. Anne didn't think. She crouched behind a fallen tree, rifle aimed at the dirt road below. She waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Then the figures of 4 men emerged. One of them, a broad-shouldered man leading the way, was singing. We ride, we hide, we strike again, for we are Marion's men. Anne squinted through the dim light, trying to make them out. But then Anne's breath caught. It was Mr. Mobley singing. Her heart searched the other faces, and then she saw him. At the end of the line, limping, moving as if he might collapse at any moment. Benjamin! She dropped the rifle and ran. Benjamin! She screamed as if he wouldn't hear her. She didn't care how she looked. She didn't care that she stumbled over roots and rocks, falling, scrambling to her feet again, running as fast as her legs would carry her. The men stopped, startled. He saw her, and Benjamin's face softened, his pain and exhaustion forgotten. Anne threw herself at him, clutching his neck, holding him as if she would never let go. Benjamin's arms tightened around her, shaking, his breath ragged. His voice, softer than she had ever heard it, whispered against her ear, I promised you, Anne. I promised you I'd come home. Mr. Mobley cleared his throat, giving the young couple a moment before clapping Anne on the shoulder. Finally, Anne pulled back, laughing and crying all at once, and turned to Mr. Mobley. She embraced him tightly. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for bringing him home. And then her voice softened. I'm so sorry about Thomas. He was loved by all of us. Mr. Mobley's jaw tightened, his grief flickering just beneath the surface. But then his grip on Anne's shoulder tightened, not in sorrow, but in excitement. Anne, he said, his voice bursting with something new, something bigger than grief. Listen to me. We won. The war is over. On the 16th, the British surrendered in Yorktown. We are free Americans. The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. Her heart stopped. The British surrendered in Yorktown on the 16th. We are free Americans, Mr. Mobley repeated. Anne's knees buckled and she dropped into the dirt road, pressing her hands to her mouth as fresh tears spilled over. Benjamin knelt beside her. No more fighting, Anne, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. We start our lives today. Anne let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A new life, a life without war, a life with Benjamin. Slowly she rose to her feet, slipping her hands into his. He squeezed it with a new confidence of a man who had fought for what he needed and won. Come on, he said with a smile, his posture straightening with confidence. Let's go tell everyone the news.